Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 5.27, Necessary and Proper. When Alexander Hamilton, at the end of 1790, proposed the second phase of his financial plan for the United States, the creation of a national bank, he would set off a series of events that would have long reverberations throughout American history. We are going to spend our time today talking about the pushback to this bank plan from men like Jefferson and Madison. However, the battle over the bank will continue long into the future. It would remain a constant magnet for controversy up until Andrew Jackson finally completely killed the bank off by refusing to renew the charter. However, we have a whole lot of things to cover between now and then. So let's move back and examine just how Jefferson and Madison planned to attack the bank from the beginning. The Bank of the United States had moved through both the Senate and then the House with relatively little initial pushback. In fact, it was met with widespread support and seemed to be well on its way towards being enacted. It was not until February 2nd, 1791, when the final debate over the passage of the bill began, that any opposition really showed up and began making waves. Unsurprisingly, with the debate in the House, the opposition of the bill was led by James Madison. Madison's opening salvo focused on the public policy argument. Although I'm going to touch on that here in a moment, in this instance, this was never really the main thrust of Madison's argument. Instead, what James Madison relied upon was an argument that undermined the constitutional foundation for the bank. Although the Constitution had existed for a few years now, and had indeed been debated ad nauseum, this was really the first time that we see an action get questioned for its constitutional legitimacy. There had, of course, been ample theoretical talk about the document during the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, and then a year afterwards as it wound its way through the states on its way to ratification. Now, though, we are going to see the bounds of the Constitution examined in a much more direct way. Although Madison did not see his arguments regarding the public policy of the bank as his strongest fight, he did still throw in a few points on the matter. Madison was deeply concerned about what a national bank would mean for the United States, specifically to how it would affect the alignment of power within the country. Hamilton believed that the bank would tie the creditor class to the government, thus bringing the government much-needed stability. The wealthy creditors in the nation would surely continue to support and encourage a government which owed them money. Madison feared this very thing, believing that such a relationship would too closely tie the wealthy creditor class and the government together, much to the detriment of the ordinary people. Using the Bank of England as an example, which again the Bank of the United States was modeled after, Madison would ask the question of just how indebted the British government was to its wealthy depositors. In other words, Madison was worried that this small group of wealthy individuals would become the backbone of the bank. With the government becoming increasingly indebted to them, they would be able to seize more and more control over the government and exert their will. Madison worried that one day everybody would wake up with the government bending to the whims of this small clique of creditors, because they, in effect, owned the government. Madison took things a step further and explained that England likewise had a few nationalized companies, like the East India Company, which themselves poured money into the government coffers. The United States, not having this secondary form of income, would find itself even more dependent upon these creditors than the British did. To really drive this point home, he used a war as an example of the danger. I don't think it will really surprise any of you when I point out that war is expensive. It costs ridiculous amounts of money to fight a war, and pretty much nothing will plunge a nation into debt faster. Part of the equation when it comes to war is that these additional costs means that the country is going to require a large infusion of money much faster. Madison wrote that in this scenario, with the country desperate, the bank lending money to the government could quickly turn around and take advantage of that same government. You need money, you say? Well, enjoy these absurd interest rates. At one point, Madison went so far as to argue that the only actual benefit of the bank was the use of banknotes, because that would reduce the wear on the actual metal specie, which would be safe and sound within the bank. Madison biographer Noah Feldman, however, points out that this was really more of a tongue-in-cheek thing, pointing out just how pointless the bank really was. In terms of policy, the biggest argument that Madison made had to do with how the banknotes would lead to actual specie being sent abroad. His argument here was that the amount of specie was predicated upon balanced trade. In essence, if there is a trade imbalance where you are importing more than you are exporting, you're going to be sending more hard currency out of the country. With readily available banknotes, it would become far too easy for money to be sent out of the country. What Madison suggested was that it would be better to have a series of banks, rather than one single central bank. From a practical perspective, this would insulate the government from risk of mismanagement. James Madison argued that what makes a lot more sense would be a bunch of smaller banks. That way, should one struggle, it would not drag down the entire American economy. In other words, don't put all of your eggs into a single basket. Although what Madison was advocating for here was something of careful pragmatism, it was clear that there were far more political reasons behind his plan. Hamilton's entire plan required there to be a single national bank that the government relied upon, not multiple banks. Recall his annoyance at all of those state banks that would ultimately start popping up. So Madison's advocacy here for multiple, smaller banks was very much designed to pour cold water over Hamilton's project. Even with these arguments, though, it seems that Madison understood that they were the weaker arguments. After laying out his public policy reasons that a bank was a bad idea, he would spend the rest of his time arguing that the bank was unconstitutional. The fact that he focused so much on these arguments tends to suggest that he believed that the public policy fight was weaker than his legal arguments. If the main part of Madison's battle against Hamilton's bank bill was going to come in the form of objections to the constitutionality of the bank, let's turn our attention to just what that means. The questions that were raised here, as we are about to see, are going to not only help define how the Constitution functions in practice, but would open up deep questions into exactly what the Constitution even was. More specifically, did it provide a broad grant of national power? Or rather, was the Constitution a narrow grant of power? Although Madison would become so completely linked to the coming constitutional battle, it was actually James Jackson of Georgia who would first bring up this question. Now, Jackson didn't really go all that far with the argument, other than bringing up the fact that there was a problem. John Lawrence from New York responded with an argument that back in 1781, under the Confederation, Congress had gone ahead and chartered a national bank. This is something that we had talked about way back in episode 5.3. Surely, if the Constitution had been created with the intention of forming a more energetic national government, and the Confederation Congress had the authority to charter a bank, then shouldn't the current Congress, at a minimum, have equal power? At this point, as Jackson and Lawrence were debating this, the motion had been to send the bill back to committee. After spending the rest of the day bouncing back and forth a bit on the issue, the motion to send the bill back to committee failed. With the hearing over but the constitutional question at least being broached, James Madison saw his opening and was determined to attack. Two primary questions were raised here. The first was to the limits of the Constitution itself. Nothing in the Constitution explicitly grants Congress the right to charter a national bank. On the other hand, nothing in the Constitution explicitly forbids the chartering of a bank either. this brings up an important question about constitutional limitations and would introduce a real schism in the constitutional interpretation that would persist long into the future. The question is whether or not the necessary and proper clause of Article 1 was sufficient to convey that power onto Congress. This would lead to a whole slew of other questions about the limits of the necessary and proper clause and exactly what it meant. Now, for the most part, the entire debate over the question of if the Constitution either explicitly mentioning or alternatively not mentioning the right to charter a bank was completely subsumed by the limits of the necessary and proper clause. So, to start our discussion, let's first ask the big question. What is the necessary and proper clause? Located in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it states that Congress has the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. What that means exactly is going to become the subject of debate for the next 3 weeks, as everybody scrambled to explain just what the necessary and proper clause meant. Advocates of the bank made the argument that Congress had all sorts of rights when it came to the economy. They had the power to collect taxes, and they had the power to borrow money. They had rights over interstate commerce. With Congress clearly having an active role in the economic health of the country, they reasoned that the necessary and proper clause gave them the power to do what was necessary to exercise that control. And you know what would assist them in expressing their power to do these things? Well, a national bank sure would be a big help. On the other side of the debate, the question was a bit more tricky and less well-defined. In his book, Reconstructing the National Bank Controversy, Politics and Law in the Early American Republic, author Eric Lamazoff writes that in reality, the opposition to the bank was really all over the place in their objections. However, they never exactly coalesced around a single argument as to why the necessary and proper clause did not apply here. In one view, one that was proposed by William Branch Giles of Virginia, it was argued that we should not assume that necessary and useful were synonyms with each other. In this interpretation, what Giles was arguing was that the standard that should be fit into the constitutional structure was that the ends could not have been produced without it. In other words, what Giles was arguing here is that the necessary and proper clause was not in place to make things easier for Congress. It was only to be used if things were necessary. Would a bank potentially be useful? Yeah, sure, absolutely it would. However, so long as there were other means for exercising the powers of Congress, it means that the bank is not necessary. Per Giles, there were other ways that the government could collect taxes and accomplish all of those things that the bank would assist with without the bank itself. Thus, the bank was unconstitutional because it was not necessary. Both Madison and Jefferson took an even more limited reading of the clause. While they agreed with Giles as to the necessary part of the equation, that necessary meant that there were no other viable options to achieve that end. They went a step further, adding a second requirement: that the means must offer significant assistance in achieving a legitimate objective. Okay, so what exactly does that mean? In his argument before the House, Madison explained that Hamilton's reading was entirely too broad. Based on the lax reading of the necessary and proper clause, so long as something might be helpful to achieving an end, it was fine. Madison, obviously, rejected that argument and explained that the clause was indeed much more narrowly tailored. What Madison was advocating for was that the government itself had the power to withhold taxes, and in the event that a bank was necessary, state banks existed. Now, you probably don't need to worry too much here about the specifics of Madison's argument as compared to Giles. This is not a legal history podcast, and I'm not sure how many, or any of you, want me to take a deep dive into the narrow interpretation of the necessary and proper clause. I bring all of this up more because I want you to all understand that amongst the bank's opponents, there was not an agreement among them as to what the limits of the necessary and proper clause should be. Indeed, there was actually a third interpretation as well, even more strict than what Madison and Jefferson were proposing. For now, though, what you need to know is that Madison and company were arguing that a bank was unnecessary to accomplish Hamilton's stated goals. Thus, it was unconstitutional. At the very core of Madison's argument was the idea that anything that was being proposed that was incompatible with the core ideals of a Republican government were going to be unconstitutional. This obviously brings up the question, though, of what exactly was incompatible with the core ideals of a republic. Madison, realizing that this was going to be one of the questions, came prepared with an answer. The suggestion here being that for those who were looking to fully understand the meaning behind the Constitution, they needed to look back at the debates surrounding the formation of the document. Even today in American politics, this remains a very potent argument for constitutional interpretation. I'm guessing that most of us have heard one politician or another talking about the mythical intent of the founders. The argument does make one raise an eyebrow, especially coming from Madison, though, because of the implications stemming from it. Because who was the framer who had the most influence over the Philadelphia Convention? Who was the author of the Virginia Plan and the man who had taken the most strides to ensuring that the people followed his vision for the future of the country? Well, of course it had been none other than James Madison, who is now telling Congress that to understand the meaning of the Constitution, maybe we should look back at what the drafters thought. And, oh, by the way, I'm sort of the biggest of the drafters. Despite this somewhat self-serving attempt, Madison continued and explained that when it came to things not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, the question should be, why isn't it listed? As Madison argued, with something as important as a bank, if it had been intended to be something that Congress could create, it would have been specifically listed. Madison was saying that the absence of the bank from the Constitution means that the drafters had implicitly decided against it, as nothing so critical would remain an implied power. This introduces a very important difference between the constitutional interpretation of Madison and Jefferson as compared to Alexander Hamilton. Based on the argument being made here by Madison, the Constitution should be viewed in a more narrow scope. Hamilton believed in something more expansive, that the Constitution provided limits, but so long as the document didn't explicitly limit an action, well, then it was fine. Madison took up the opposite side of this argument, that if the Constitution failed to specifically grant a power, then it should be assumed that said power was most likely going to run afoul of the compact. When it came to the question of if the necessary and proper clause would provide the necessary justification, Madison took that narrow view. He argued that should a broad interpretation of the necessary and proper clause be adopted, one where the government could do anything necessary to achieve its goals, it could risk the entire Republican form of government under the guise of just making things easier. This had been one of the serious concerns of those anti-federalists, whom Madison had assured was not something that they needed to worry about. Now, though, here he was, indeed, very worried about it. If Madison's entire argument had been that the bank was unconstitutional because it was unnecessary, and that ultimately it posed a threat to the very nature of the Republic, he would find that the majority of his support came from the South, whereas the North was far more in favor of the Hamiltonian policies. Indeed, the Northern representatives were not planning on just laying down and allowing Madison to carry the day. and would indeed fire back at him with their first opportunity. Whereas Madison had argued that if something was not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, it was improper to imply its existence. His opponents, specifically here Fisher Ames, fired back that it's a little late to be pointing that out now. Congress had been meeting for the last 2 years, and during that time, pretty much every law that they had passed required a certain degree of implication of powers not explicitly stated in the Constitution. Ames, going further, explained that Madison's strict interpretation of the Constitution was a mistake, and that it was equally as dangerous for the government to not exercise the powers that they had, as it was for them to use the powers that they didn't have. Ames argued that the Necessary and Proper Clause did not convey any new powers to the Congress, but rather it established that some powers were to be implied. In what is my personal favorite moment of this particular debate, one congressman read part of Federalist 44, where Publius argued that of course the Necessary and Proper Clause established implied powers. Otherwise, it would require a complete digest of law on every single subject to which the Constitution relates. Moreover, it would require the Constitution to anticipate all future events. In other words, of course the Constitution requires implied powers because we cannot possibly plan for everything. Now, as we stand here in 1791, the exact identity of Publius had yet to be figured out, although it was highly rumored that Alexander Hamilton was involved. As such, it was assumed that Federalist 44 was written by Alexander Hamilton. This is what Elias Boudinot believed when he read the section to Congress. He fully thought that he was reading the words of Hamilton directly. Boudinot was wrong, though, and Federalist 44 was not Alexander Hamilton's work. Rather, it was the work of James Madison, who must have had a whole lot of feelings as he heard his own words, unbeknownst to anybody but him, used to refute his current argument. At the core of everything, though, was the basic argument that the bank, regardless of Madison's downplaying of it, was indeed critical. It was Fisher Ames who argued that the bank would bring numerous advantages, and that it was indeed necessary when it came to raising revenue and as a lender during emergencies. Unfortunately for Madison, he was never exactly operating from a position of strength in these arguments. He was on the defensive from the get-go, and as demonstrated by his opposition, he was never able to present an argument strong enough to wholly refute the pro-bank position. As such, the bank bill passed with relative ease by a vote of 39 to 20. This vote would also highlight the growing sectional divide of the country, as the bank bill vote saw the North voting in favor of the bank and the South opposed. This division between the two parts of the country was hardly surprising. The Southern states always worried that the Hamiltonian programs favored the more business-centered North, while acting to the detriment of the agrarian South. With the bank bill getting first through the Senate, and then, despite Madison's vigorous objections, through the House, all that remained was for George Washington to sign off on it. Here, Madison and company viewed a final opportunity to try and kill the legislation. To this point, 2 years into his presidency, Washington had not yet exercised his veto power. Opponents to the bank bill argued that this would be a great time for him to try it out. There likely was good reason here too for Hamilton to worry. Washington was, after all, a Virginian, and may well be sympathetic to the concerns of the Southern states. Likewise, as we are about to see, he was frequently writing back and forth with Madison. His Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, and the Attorney General was also a Virginian in Edmund Randolph. That is a whole lot of powerful voices whispering in Washington's ear that the bank was a pretty bad idea, and that it would ruin the very nature of the young nation. To his credit here, Washington fully understood that he was way out of his depth. George Washington was a lot of things, but he was well aware that he was no political theorist. That is not meant to be a put-down of him either, because what Washington did so well was to prepare for this foreseeable problem. To do this, he surrounded himself with people who were political theorists. As much as his cabinet was itching to get into his ear regarding the bank, he knew that he was going to need to rely on their guidance. He was also not blind to the fact that there was going to be a split amongst his advisors. Washington was well aware that Jefferson and, although not a member of his cabinet, Madison would provide a very different take as compared to Alexander Hamilton. To begin, Washington requested advice from Madison, Jefferson, and Randolph. Once that was complete, he asked Hamilton to provide the exact same thing. Hamilton wrote a sweeping essay about the nature of the powers of the United States for the president, explaining that the sovereignty of the country and the Constitution itself conveyed upon the United States all powers not specifically forbidden. Hamilton used the example that everybody would agree that, in the interest of regulating trade, the government could fund the construction of a lighthouse. Nowhere in the Constitution did it specifically mention that the government either had or lacked the power to fund the construction of a lighthouse. Thus, it was an implied power of the government. In addition to explaining all the benefits that came from the bank, Hamilton explained that a rigid government would be suffocated to the point of collapse, and that the new system needed flexibility. Hamilton made a good point here, because had it not been a frustratingly rigid Articles of Confederation that had in fact collapsed just a few years earlier, Washington really does appear to have weighed these arguments back and forth too. According to Madison biographer Noah Feldman, years after the fact, Madison said that he and Washington had talked about the subject, and that he had believed at the time that Washington was receptive to his argument. Per Ron Chernow, in his biography of Hamilton, after reviewing Hamilton's arguments, Washington was sufficiently convinced and did not bother going back to Jefferson to offer an opportunity at a rebuttal. Although that may well be the case, I think it's also possible that Washington just wanted the issue behind him. As we are going to see down the road, there are times when these tight issues are raised that Washington would show a real interest in reaching a decision and just putting the matter to bed. We are going to see this in relation to what would become known as the Jay Treaty. Plus, by the time that Washington got Hamilton's massive 15,000-word argument in favor of the bank, it was February 23, 1791. Washington only had 10 days once the bill reached his desk to veto it, and depending on who you asked, the date was rapidly approaching. Indeed, by the time that Washington signed off on February 25th, arguments were already forming that it was a mere formality, because Washington could no longer veto the bill anyway. With the bank now approved, James Madison found himself on something of a losing streak. For all of the power that he had and all of the influence he had over the creation of the Constitution some years earlier, he once again found himself on the losing end of a battle with Alexander Hamilton. These losses had a profound effect on Madison and would help dictate the coming decade of American politics. The loss over the bank bill would push Jefferson and Madison into a much closer alliance, and saw the two men increasingly working together. One way that this partnership would flourish is through a visit that Madison had with an old college friend, Philip Freneau. Freneau was a talented writer who had mostly bounced around working some odd jobs. He was a fairly accomplished poet. He had worked at the post office and had worked as the captain of a small ship. What got Madison's attention is that Freneau had spent time as a newspaper editor. Here in Freneau, you had a man who was a talented writer and had experience editing a newspaper. That just might be something that could come in handy. Now, understand that newspapers of this era were extraordinarily partisan projects. We have talked about this at some length already, so I won't belabor the point, but you don't really have newspapers out there claiming to offer unbiased reporting, because why would anybody want that? Historian Jeffrey Palsy explains in his book, The Tyranny of the Printers, Newspaper Politics in the Early American Republic, that even before the political parties themselves had official platforms like we think of them today, newspapers would help create those party identities. Now, to be fair, much of what Palsy is talking about here occurs after 1800. Bringing men like Freneau into the mix is a direct line to this development, especially as it pertains to his relationship with Jefferson and how it would evolve over time. Madison believed that with his talents, Freneau would prove to be a valuable ally to his and Jefferson's cause. With that information, he went to Jefferson and let him know that, hey, we should hire this Freneau guy to translate French in the State Department. Jefferson initially balked at the idea, because although Freneau knew some French, he certainly did not know enough to translate for the State Department. Madison went on to tell Jefferson, you should hire him to do the job anyway, and that it doesn't really matter if he knows any French at all. Jefferson picked up on the hint that the job was merely a cover, and just like that, Freneau was now an employee of the State Department. Jefferson seemingly acknowledged his intentions in a February 28th letter to Freneau, where he wrote, the clerkship for foreign languages in my office is vacant. The salary is indeed very low, being but $250 a year. But also it gives so little to do as to not interfere with any other calling the person may choose, which would not absent him from the seat of government. I was told a few days ago that it might, perhaps, be convenient to you to accept it. In other words, Jefferson was basically saying, come take this job. The pay isn't great, but you're going to have plenty of free time to do other things. Like, say, run a partisan newspaper from inside the actual government. It is worth noting that the date here was February 28th, so just 3 days after Washington had signed off on the bank bill. Both Jefferson and Madison had been worried for a while as to the degree that Hamilton was using the press to help influence events. Throughout 1791, there was a noticeable increase in the rise of partisan press. One paper, the Gazette of the United States, which was founded in 1789 by John Freneau, quickly became a staunch defender of the Federalist policies and of the administration itself. They saw papers like the Gazette of the United States as being dangerously anti-Republican. The way they saw it, the Federalists were using the press to create an identity for themselves, and that they were acting like something of a proto-political party. During the debates over the bank, Madison had personally been annoyed by what he saw as interference from the press. He believed this influence had become so powerful that these journalists that Hamilton had in his pocket may have gone so far as to threaten Washington. There was real worry for Jefferson and Madison that should the press continue to run rampant, it would erode all those important Republican values. The solution was, probably as you guessed, Philip Freneau. Now, Freneau was not immediately on board with the idea, and indeed in a letter on March 5th to Jefferson, responding to Jefferson's letter on February 28th, which we discussed a moment ago, Freneau declined the position. It took considerable persuading from Jefferson and Madison to bring him into the fold. The agreement that would end up sealing the deal was that, through his position in the State Department, Freneau would basically be funneled not only information about the State Department's activities, but would have access to the actual documents themselves. Plus, just in case he needed to sweeten the deal, Jefferson promised Freneau government contracts that would help ensure that the paper was properly funded. Per Gordon Wood, by the time that 1792 came around, Freneau was busily publishing about Hamilton's plans to subvert liberty and to install a formal aristocracy and monarchy in the United States. Jefferson, on the other hand, well, he was the true defender of liberty and really the only real safeguard between Hamilton's endless scheming. As Wood goes on to explain, there was not exactly a party system in 1790. However, men like Freneau and Freneau began to alter the national debate. During this era, it was far more rare for anybody to sign their actual name to something, meaning that everybody here was writing in pseudonyms. The advantage of that is that the authors of these pieces could say pretty much anything they wanted, or stake out as extreme a position as they felt like, without any serious risk of blowback. If it seems like we have been orbiting around the question of parties for a while, without ever actually reaching the destination, that is because to some degree, we are. Americans, of course, were well aware of political parties. They had been a staple of British politics since long before the Revolution, and were something that the majority of Americans deeply distrusted. We have seen several times now a real fear of things slipping into party-based factionalism, and it was something that most were eager to avoid. These attacks in the press, though, by men like Freneau and Fenno, helped to galvanize those divisions in Congress, to help to paint the lines and establish the talking points of the new parties. By 1792, you had people beginning to talk more seriously about these parties and their role in Congress. At this point, you begin to see Madison connected with what was being referred to as the Republican Party, which stood in opposition to the corrupt and greed of the Hamilton-led Federalists. The development of modern political parties is going to take a while to fully come into focus. However, it is not hard to see these lines becoming well-formed by the beginning of 1792. Although formal organization did not yet exist when it came to the parties, the press was beginning to step into that void and to craft and dictate the national conversations. Sure, it was rudimentary, but you now had a meaningful opposition to Hamilton and the Federalists. This existence of an opposition painted the Federalists as a party in power. And just like that, you had two groups operating in a way that increasingly looked like a political party system. Next time, we are going to move right on ahead and continue to look at the growing political divides throughout the remainder of 1791 and moving into 1792. We are likewise going to begin taking a look at a growing bit of disgruntlement from farmers who were unhappy with some of these new imposts, especially as they pertained to alcohol. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as we move deeper into 1791.